Hey, sixth grade. You know, the Spartans were really fierce. In fact, they were so fierce that when their weapons got old, they threw them away. They thought that if it wasn't sharp, it didn't have a point. Oh, man. I went to a Greek restaurant recently during the lockdown to pick up an order. And the food was really good, but I wouldn't want to go eat at that restaurant. It is a little Spartan inside. Okay. Bad jokes. All right. So we're going to be learning about Sparta today, but first we have to finish off our lesson on Athenian democracy, and we left off by talking about the court system and juries. So remember, the Athenian court system did not have judges or lawyers. It was made up of a jury. So yesterday I gave the example of Joshua L. being accused of committing a murder. And in a different kind of court system, he would go before a judge, and the judge would decide if he's innocent or guilty based on the evidence. Well, that's not how Athenian courts worked. In Athenian courts, Joshua L. would go in front of a jury. And a jury could be made up of any free male citizen of the city-state. So there could be hundreds or even thousands of people on the jury. And they would let Joshua L. defend himself against the charge. Right? Again, this is why it's important for Athenian citizens to have a public education where they learn things like how to give a public speech, because if you ever get accused of a crime, it's always good to be able to make a public speech explaining why you're innocent. Right? So Joshua L. would give a speech explaining why he is innocent, or I don't know, maybe Joshua L. would say he was guilty. I don't know, Josh. But if he was innocent, he would give a speech and then try to defend himself, and then the jury would cast a vote, right? And basically the way it worked is if more people voted that he was innocent than guilty, he was let free. If more people voted that he was guilty than innocent, he'd be found guilty, and then he'd be sentenced for his crime. All right. So one advantage of having a really big jury like this is that the jurors are not going to be vulnerable to getting bribed. Right? So if you have a really small jury like we have in the United States court system, the jury only has 12 members. It'd be fairly easy to bribe some of the jurors to vote a certain way, right? Well, when you have thousands or even hundreds of people on a jury, you can't bribe all those people. It makes it really, really hard to sway their decision. So one advantage of a big jury is you don't result in bribery is not as easy. One bad thing about a big jury, though, is that majority vote doesn't necessarily mean that a person is innocent or guilty. So imagine you have 1,000 people on Joshua L.'s jury, and 499 vote that Joshua L. is innocent, but 501 vote that he is guilty. Well, under the law, Joshua L. would be found guilty because the majority of the jury decided that he's guilty of murder. But does a difference of 2 votes really give you a lot of confidence that Joshua L. actually committed a murder? Probably not, right? So having a large jury that makes decisions by majority vote makes people less confident in what the jury actually decides. By contrast, in the United States, our juries, which have 12 people, make decisions, but the decision has to be unanimous. So if Joshua L. is tried with murder in the United States, only 12 jurors will decide if he's innocent or guilty, but in order for him to be declared innocent or guilty, all 12 have to agree with each other. So if you get called onto a jury, basically what happens is you listen to the evidence that's been presented. The judge will give you some directions. And then you go into a room with the other jurors, and you all have to agree on guilt or innocence, right? And you could be stuck in the room with the other jurors for hours or sometimes even for days without reaching a unanimous decision, because sometimes people just disagree, right? Some people on the jury might think, you know what, Joshua L. looks really sneaky. I bet he murdered that person. Uh, Otherwise, there might be some people on the jury who think, no, Joshua L. is just a sweet, innocent boy. He would never kill anyone. I'm never, ever going to say that he's the murderer. Right? So when you have a unanimous jury, it's really, really hard to reach a decision. But if the jury does reach a decision, then people are more confident in it because it's unanimous. All right. By the way, if a jury doesn't reach a unanimous decision, what ends up happening is it's called a hung jury, and then usually a mistrial is declared, and then the trial starts all over again with a different jury, right? And that doesn't happen very much, but when it does happen, it's very inconvenient for everyone that's involved. Okay, so yeah, that's Athenian juries. Now, I do want you to keep in mind in our lesson on democracy that Athenian democracy worked really well compared to other types of ancient governments. Uh, but just because you hear the word democracy, it doesn't mean it was good for everyone. Remember, slaves, metics, foreigners, women could still not participate in government, right? Only male citizens who were free could participate in the government. So even though it's a democracy, it wasn't exactly free. All right, one more quick note on democracy in Athens, and then we'll move on to Sparta. So Athens had something called a direct democracy, which is different than what we have in the United States. In the United States, we have something called a representative democracy or a democratic republic. In a direct democracy, citizens vote directly on the issues, right? So the assembly will vote on whether or not a law gets made, right? It's not how it works in the United States. In the United States, our democracy works with elected officials. So we vote for people who will vote on our behalf. So we have representatives in the government that we vote for, and then those representatives cast votes based on what they think is right or what they think we want. Right? So that's called a representative democracy. It's different than a direct democracy. If we had a direct democracy, we, the people, would vote on everything, right? Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on what you think, direct democracy is pretty much impossible in big countries. So the United States has somewhere between 330 and 370 million people in it. And it is impossible to have a direct democracy when you have hundreds of millions of people voting. How would you count all those votes? It would be impossible. So that's why we have a representative democracy, right? So direct democracy worked in Athens because the city-state is small and because the citizens worked hard to make sure that their direct democracy worked well, right? So basically, even though they're different, I do want to say there's one big similarity between direct democracy, like Athens had, and representative democracy, like the United States has. And this is based on the fundamental belief that government decisions should be made in the interests of the people and by the people. Right? This is called rule by the people. In other words, power in government doesn't come from a king, it doesn't come from oligarchies, it comes from people. Okay, that brings us to Sparta, our second city-state in this chapter. So Athens develops a lot of I'm sorry, a sixth grade parent just sent me a message. Hold on, I need to respond to this because I'm going to forget. All right, so Athens sets the example on how All right, sorry. So Athens sets the example for the city-states on how direct democracy can work. A lot of city-states in Greece follow Athens' lead and also start to include democracies. Sparta, however, does not, and there's a few reasons why. Right? So Sparta, unlike most Greek city-states, is inland. It's on the middle of a peninsula. It's not near the coastline. This means that it does not have the opportunity to become wealthy through trade or by using the ocean. Right? It can never become a sea power. So instead, Sparta had to acquire resources by expanding its territory. Right? And the way it did this was mainly through conquest. Right? So in order to conquer the other city-states and in order to continue to control what it had already conquered, Sparta had to have a strong military. Right? So Athens develops a democracy for a variety of reasons that we've already discussed. Sparta develops a different form of government because democracy in Sparta at this point is really not possible. They need to become more militarily focused. They're going to develop something called a military state for a variety of reasons, and democracy and military states do not fit very well together. Right? So instead, they're going to develop a government called an oligarchy. All right. So an oligarchy is a form of government in which a small number of elites, usually aristocrats, make all the decisions and have all the political power. Right? But before we get to how the oligarchy worked, we first need to talk about the history of how Spartan government worked. So in the beginning, Sparta's government was a lot like the governments of the other Greek city-states, meaning there were kings that ran the show. Sparta was a little bit different, though, because ancient Sparta at first had two kings at the same time. So they had a government that was run by two royal families, and each royal family had a leader, a male leader, who was seen as the king. So Sparta was kind of like a two-headed snake, right? They had two families, and at the head of each family was a guy, and that guy was the king. So they had two kings at the same time. When you have two kings, that means you don't have to be as protective as a king if you only had one. So for this reason, it was very common for the Spartan kings to actually fight in the battles with the other Spartans. Usually, when there's a war, the king sends the army out to war, and then the generals are in charge of guiding the army on the battlefield. Not so in Sparta. In Sparta, the king was on the battlefield with the soldiers. Right? And they could afford to do this because if one king was killed in battle, Sparta still had another king that they could rely on back home. Right? So almost every time the Spartan soldiers went out to battle, one of their kings was with them. Now, the kings were in charge of Sparta's government, and beneath the kings was a group called the Council of Elders. So this is where we get the idea of oligarchy, the beginnings of oligarchy from. The Council of Elders was a group of 28 men who were old. They were in their 60s, which in the ancient world, if you lived into your 60s, you were considered super duper old. So these elders were men in their 60s, and there was 28 of them. And these were the ones who really ran the day-to-day operations in Sparta. Sparta also, like Athens, had an assembly. All free adult male citizens were part of the assembly. And the assembly did have some political power. However, it was very different than Athens' assembly because the Spartan assembly only had 9,000 people. Right? So only 9,000 men were considered free adult male citizens in Sparta. In Athens, it was about 50,000. Right? So it's a big, big difference. Another difference is that the Spartan assembly really did not have very much power. It did have the power to pass laws, but it had to get the approval of the Council of Elders in order to do this.